So this, I understand, is your favorite book when you were a child.
And I still love this book.
What was that? What was it about the book?
She was a little African-American girl who had the little socks. She had 2 pigtails, and she was a brownie. And at that time, I was a brownie. I had the 2 pigtails, and I had a family that was reflected in this book. There weren't many books that showed African Americans in a sympathetic way, and these lovely, she's an award-winning illustrator, I didn't find that out until much later, who depicted, and this is one of my favorite illustrations, because I found years later this photo of my family, my grandfather. I'm over here sitting at the table with the china, with all of the things that were reflected in this book, and it really emphasized later when I became a children's librarian that children need to see themselves reflected in books. Books can be mirrors and they can be windows.
I'm a retired professor of history and African American studies at the University of Albany. Before that, I was a professor at CCNY in New York City. And you know, that's my background. I was educated in Philadelphia and Central High School, went to Kenyon College and did my graduate work at Harvard in Soviet studies, actually. Today I'll be reading excerpts from my book. It's called Breaching Jericho's Walls. And it is a story of my own life, but at the same time, I think it's the story of the lives of many of my contemporaries. It's important today because we're centering on the Joseph E. Hill School in Philadelphia. I'm talking about a wonderful school, and I'm going to be talking about our principal, Nellie Bright, who was one of the one of the greatest educators I've ever met. Also, some of the aspects of that life. So let me begin reading a little bit. I'm not going to sit down and read boom, 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 boom. I'm going to, just read a few excerpts as we go on. The school bordered on Vernon Park, so you could actually see the trees and the park benches and pagodas from some of our classrooms. If you were willing to risk a cuff on the ear for looking out the window, because they were pretty rough teachers, let me put it that way. They did not spare the rod at all. And Mrs. Bright was one of the most beautiful, the principal, was one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. Tall, angular, perfectly proportioned, hair jet black and warm pulled back. Her eyes were almond-shaped, and her pigeon-toed walk was purposeful and studied, no motion wasted. Bright always had a stern expression on her face, and her eyes, when she surveyed a classroom or auditorium, were like a hawk's eyes. She did not believe in sparing the rod. And lest we forget that, she walked with a wooden pointer in her hand, and this lady didn't play. We were all her children, and she expected great things from us. We had pictures of African Americans all around the school. There were pictures of Paul Robeson, of Toussaint Louverture, the great Haitian revolutionary, Frederick Douglass, Alexander Dumas, the great French black writer. All these pictures were around us. And Marian Anderson came to our school, this black woman from down South Philadelphia. She came up to the school and she would sing for us and also kind of just tell us hello with her beautiful, gentle ways. Now, every assembly started with the Negro National Anthem. We didn't call it the Black National Anthem, we called it the Negro National Anthem. And you had to memorize that by the time you got to the third grade. We learned the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar, the great African-American poet, and Langston Hughes. I know rivers, I have spoken of rivers. We learned all those things. So we learned those things at the same time we learned, the greater culture, the American culture around us. So we learned the broader kind of culture there. But we were taught always to appreciate the beauty in our own souls. And that library became the focus of many of our lives. The library was not segregated, and as a matter of fact, had a wonderful white librarian who encouraged everybody who went into that library to, have books. And she would keep feeding me books until one day I couldn't carry the pile of books home. That's how much, how many books they had. So it was a wonderful, wonderful place.
Let me first start by congratulating the awardees for 2020. And then I want to just briefly touch on what history has meant to me, and again, how that played into storytelling, because stories were served up to me quite early. My family migrated from the South, as well as the other families on East Earlham Street, which is right behind the historic Germantown structure and building. And so the families moved in. It was an all-Black block. Story played a role because there really wasn't a sense of history at that point, as much as because most of the families wanted to forget their histories, or not necessarily to put it on in another box, to store it away, to stow it away, and not to open it. My family never went south again. I always say that in so many ways, I think when they packed up to go north, or sometimes I like to say up south, they brought with them the Southern sort of culture with them. And storytelling was a part of that. So, and a lot of the stories that were told were the stories that were rich in African-American folklore. John Henry, the tales of Uncle Remus. But it was this sense of history came when I left Earlham Street, whether it was to go to school, the barbershop and whatnot. And I always had a sort of a curious eye. And I was struck by these unusual, unique buildings. And it wasn't really until after leaving the Philadelphia Museum School of Art, which is now the University of the Arts, that I was introduced through my craft, through my gift, projects that dealt with African American history. And I got a call from National Geographic magazine. And this is Philadelphia's native son, Charles Blockson. And he was going to write a piece on the Underground Railroad. And I was going to illustrate it. So I had not met Charles at that time. So we were going to meet together with the people from National Geographic in Philadelphia. Where did we meet? We met in Germantown. We met, and I was reintroduced to those magical buildings, architectural buildings that so impressed me, because I knew there was some value, something there that I needed to unlock. And there was Charles Blockson to help me unlock it. And so all of the things that certainly, and maybe that I had stored away, was all of a sudden at my fingertips. Not only was these things at my fingertips, but it was my neighborhood. In other words, in so many ways, certainly I owned the history, and certainly we're descendants from the enslaved, but I owned, it was my neighborhood. It was the Johnson house, that structure that sat there, and that beautiful stone structure that I passed so often. Now, could I possibly been walking in the same footsteps as Harriet Tubman? So history, story, all of that came together. It all made sense. And not only did it make sense in terms of what I was gathering and whatnot, I could now look at the Uncle Remus tales differently. I could look at John Henry differently. They all had a different kind of meaning. And that past that my father, my mother, my grandparents didn't share, I had somewhat of an access to it. Story, history, neighborhood, community, all of it was there. And so to receive a call from Tuami to accept this honor from the historic Germantown, I was back home. And I don't know, I mean, there is a power in all the awardees receiving this beautiful award and recognition. And but I could visit historic Germantown and walk 2 blocks to where I grew up.